The CE says he has no knowledge of a national security law adoption proposal. Tung Chi-hua comments on the CE's latest policy address. And the Islamic State group threatens to kill 2 Japanese hostages.
Hello and a very good evening. Controversy abounds after a local deputy to the National People's Congress suggested that Hong Kong should implement the mainland's national security laws until it completes its own anti-subversion legislation. In response, Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying says the administration currently has no plans to do so. And as Owen Fung reports, lawmakers from across the political divide have criticised the proposal.
The National People's Congress is expected to pass the amended national security laws in March. Stanley Ng, a local deputy to the NPC, proposed that the laws should also be adopted in Hong Kong in the form of an annex to the Basic Law. And this can be done before the Article 23 legislation, Ng suggests. Under Article 23 of the Basic Law, the SAR will enact laws on its own to prohibit acts of treason, secession, sedition and subversion. But such legislation efforts were shelved indefinitely following massive protests in 2003. Speaking ahead of the Executive Council meeting today, Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying said he doesn't know the details of Ng's proposal. Leung also stressed that the government hasn't been considering the issue of adopting national security laws, while adding that there aren't any plans to pass legislations under Article 23. Secretary for Security Lai Tung-kwok echoed the CE's comment.
Article 23 of the Basic Law has a very clear guideline for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region to enact the law. But up to now, we do not have any timetable to enact such a piece of law.
Meanwhile, pan-democratic legislators criticized Ng's proposal for undermining the one country, two systems policy.
I just find it very staggering for a member of the National People's Congress to make such a recommendation, which I think could be in breach of the Basic Law and also in breach of the central government's policy of one country, two systems.
Another legislator, Michael Tian, who is also a local deputy to the NPC, says Ng's suggestion is inappropriate.
In Hong Kong, we recognize only the Basic Law and our local legislation. This is what was given to us, and we must safeguard that.
Tian added that making such suggestions will only lead to negative reactions. Ng declined to be interviewed, saying that he doesn't have specific details for his plan yet. Owen Fung, TVB News.
Former Chief Executive Tung Chi-hua has also waded into the debate over the introduction of mainland laws here. He says it's only a matter of time national security legislation will be implemented in Hong Kong. Stephanie Choi has that story.
The former CE and current vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference said today, according to the Basic Law, the central government has the power to introduce mainland laws to Hong Kong. Tung believes it's just a matter of time Article 23 national security legislation would be enacted.
I think the day will come when it will be necessary. I don't know when it is going to be because I'm not running Hong Kong. And I just have this feeling.
Speaking to the press for the third time in 4 months, Tung also praised Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying's latest policy address. The address is rich in content and has a clear vision, he said. This shows how closely the Hong Kong government listens to the people's opinion, he added. When asked whether the CE's criticisms of a student publication by the University of Hong Kong represented an attack on free speech, Tung said he agrees with Leung. The students' views are worrying, he said, explaining that the country's sovereignty should not be violated and that national security must not be compromised. We mustn't let our guard down, Tung stressed, adding that although people are entitled to different views, they must be responsible for what they say. Leung has criticized the publication for its views on self-determination. And on political reform, Tong called on the people of Hong Kong to remain objective and to bear in mind the interests of the SAR so that universal suffrage could be implemented in 2017. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
The mainland economy has posted its smallest annual growth in nearly a quarter of a century. The country is now bracing itself for a so-called new normal of slower yet higher quality growth. Would this mark a new era in China's ongoing economic transformation? Beijing announced today the world's number 2 economy recorded a 7.4% growth in 2014. That's slightly less than the government target of 7.5% and the smallest growth rate since 1990. A housing slowdown, weaker domestic demand and a sluggish global recovery were seen as factors behind a slowdown in growth last year. Ma Jiantang, head of the National Bureau of Statistics, put on a brave face, saying the 7.4% increase was still in line with market expectations. He stressed the mainland economy remains steady under the new normal, characterized by stable growth, enhanced quality and improved social welfare. The International Monetary Fund is now projecting a further slowdown in growth across the border this year.
We have revised our growth projection downward from 7.1 in October to 6.8%, in part because we see this healthy adjustment in the real estate sector going forward. This is going to be a multi-year process where, of course, investment demand will be slower in order to facilitate the adjustment.
The IMF has also lowered its global growth forecast over the next 2 years because of weaknesses in most major economies. World GDP is now expected to expand by 3.5% this year, down 0.3 percentage points as projected earlier. And it's tipped to grow by 3.7% in 2016. Still, those figures would be stronger than a 3.3% increase last year. Next, tragedy in the city of Taoyuan in Taiwan. 6 firefighters were killed in a blaze that swept through a bowling alley. All the victims were in their 20s. Authorities say a metal roof collapsed on them after a sudden burst of flames. The fire broke out at the 3-story structure during the small hours today. 2 people were rescued from the bowling alley, which was closed at the time. Firefighters suspect the blaze began at a transformer box that had been illegally modified. The mayor of Taoyuan has ordered a thorough investigation into the disaster.
The militant group Islamic State has issued a video online threatening to kill 2 Japanese hostages unless a $200 million ransom is paid within 72 hours. Just like other hostage threats made earlier by Islamic State, the video was posted on militant websites associated with the group. It shows a black-clad, knife-brandishing figure standing in a desert area along with 2 kneeling men in orange jumpsuits. Speaking with a British accent, the militant told the Japanese public to pressure the government to stop its support for the US-led coalition waging a military campaign against Islamic State. The 2 captives were identified as Kenji Gotojogo and Haruna Yakua. Gogo is a freelance reporter who went to Syria last year to report on the civil war there. He met Yukawa, a private military company operator, and helped him travel to Iraq in June. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, now on a visit to the Middle East, vowed to save the hostages at a press conference in Jerusalem. Earlier on his trip, he pledged $200 million in non-military aid to countries battling Islamic State militants. In Tokyo, Japan's chief cabinet secretary declined to say whether the government will pay the ransom.
And Japan is looking to develop its first overseas military base. Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakatani recently visited the country's anti-piracy base in the East African nation of Djibouti. Tokyo opened the facility back in 2011. About 180 self-defense forces personnel are currently deployed there. Media reports out of Japan say Tokyo wants to extend the functions of the base to include, for example, anti-terror and disaster relief efforts. China has expressed concerns. Xinhua news agency quoted observers as saying building a long-term overseas base could increase the danger of war involving Japan. Well, 4 men will appear in a French court today charged on suspicion of links to a gunman involved in France's deadliest terrorist attacks in decades. As police across Europe chase down leads on the terrorist cell, European officials say it's time for greater cooperation with the Arab world to fight radical Islam. James Aiken reports.
With Europe on high alert, the EU's foreign policy chief emerged from a foreign ministers' meeting that was aimed at forging a united response to the threat from militant extremists.
We need is an alliance, a dialogue, a work together in cooperation, because we are all facing the same threat. And this, I think, is going to be something we will need to work more and more.
Meanwhile, the French president has repeated his defense of freedom of the press.
La France ne fait pas de leçons.
At an anniversary event for a French news agency, François Hollande said France is not insulting anybody by defending its ideas, but he said France will not accept intolerance. But more outrage is likely as a controversial, award-winning French writer launches his latest novel. The book, Submission, imagines France under Islamic rule and criticizes the establishment as well as Islamists. In Germany and Denmark, anti-Islam rallies continue to attract thousands. But in some cases, the protesters have been outnumbered by counter-protesters.
They say they're not racist, but they are, you know? And it's not fair that you have to explain yourself just because you're Muslim, because some idiots are doing a terror act. It's not fair that you're blaming a whole population for it.
The protests have prompted the German Chancellor to explain that it's her duty to protect the right to demonstrate, regardless of the issue. Angela Merkel offered federal security support after an anti-Islam march was cancelled in Dresden because of a terrorist threat. Meanwhile, Pope Francis has attempted to clarify remarks he made last week about the limits of freedom of speech in response to the Paris attacks. Speaking to reporters on a flight back to Rome after leaving the Philippines, the Pope said freedom of expression must take into consideration the human response to provocation and therefore must be prudent. James Aiken, TVB News.
And still to come on the news tonight. Hong Kong and mainland authorities smash a human smuggling syndicate. A crackdown on subdivided flats in a Chunwan industrial building. And in Russia, an abandoned baby saved by cat.
Once again, I must ask too much of you.
Saturday.
This memory is everything.
Only
You're the chosen one, Harry.
Can unlock the secret.
The Atlas would leave the fate of our world to chance.
That can save them all.
Fight back, you coward!
Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince on Pearl.
收唔到，收到，收唔到，收到，收唔到，收到，收唔到，唔係靠彩數，遠足前應準備好，睇地圖，上網攞料實幫到。一旦遇上緊急事故，就打112，只要有任何一間電話公司嘅網絡覆蓋到，警察就會收到。呢，揾到佢求救實收到，拎埋對講機就更好。拜拜。
我哋收到啦，你又收到冇？
Be prepared for your outing. Know more about communications in country areas.
The time now is
7:44.
The time check was brought to you by Seiko.
And a warm welcome back to TVB News. The Immigration Department and mainland authorities have smashed a people smuggling syndicate which brought Vietnamese nationals into Hong Kong. As Evelyn Leung reports, 23 people were arrested.
During the operation, the Immigration Department seized a number of fake Hong Kong identity cards, bank and employment documents. The department said starting